steel, paying more for health care than they do for steel.
Well, that is a huge issue, and in part the largest single component of that until very recently has been the cost of health care for retirees. Out of a total wage bill, that is wages and compensation, that amounted to about $16 per hour for the average worker at GM. But the issue isn't retirees having health care. That ought to be a human right that all retirees have. And this was contractually negotiated over a 3-decade period. The issue here is a failure of public policy in Washington on the issue of health care over many decades that put it at the bargaining table in Detroit, where it's an unsustainable burden. Recognizing this, in 2007, the union and General Motors and the other Detroit automakers set up for each of the companies an independent health care trust fund. That was only funded to 60% of its total liability in 2007, but by the end of 2009, it takes health care for retirees off the company's books, and it becomes a responsibility of the union and this independent healthcare trust fund. So that clears the books and makes this not an issue going forward, but it does create a high risk for the retirees, and it creates some real issues for the UAW, who's going to be responsible for this going forward. So, short answer, yes, the cost of health care is an issue, but the solution to that issue, in my view, is not getting rid of health care for retirees, particularly after decades of promise, but rather addressing this in a responsible way in Washington, for auto workers to be sure, but for all Americans.
On that issue of health care, Ralph Nader, Harley Shaiken writes, the United States, the only major auto-producing country in the world without national health insurance. Unlike their competitors, U.S. automakers forced to shoulder the crippling burden of health care costs for their employees.
Well, I mean, it's listening to Harley Shaiken makes me wonder why the task force appointed by President Obama was composed of know-nothing Wall Street types instead of people who have studied and know the auto industry for years. And that's why we're getting a wrong-headed policy. And the point he made earlier, Amy, is it needs to be made again and again. We've crossed that Rubicon with GM and Chrysler. The taxpayer is bailing out these two companies. We either preserve that manufacturing capacity and that structure in this country, or we allow the devastation by the export of these industries and factories to China and elsewhere, the devastation in communities to increase the unemployment compensation costs, the social service costs, the Medicaid costs that will have to be transmitted to these devastated communities and people. So we need a big debate here, and that debate can only really take place in an authoritative way in Congress, and that means Speaker Pelosi and Senator Reid have got to recover their abdicated responsibility here and begin to try to put the pieces together. That will not be done by the Bankruptcy Court. The Bankruptcy Court is a mechanism for the Obama administration to escape responsibility for $70 billion or so of investment in those two companies and say, oh, the court made us do it. And that's what we've got to focus on. And in terms of health care, again, single-payer health care will relieve these burdens on these manufacturers, level the playing field in terms of competition with other companies in the auto industry. And once again, it's not going to be the hoked-up proposals for health care that you see floating around Capitol Hill and in the White House. It's got to be full Medicare for all with quality and cost control. And the key website for that is singlepayeraction.org.
Ralph Nader, do you hold out hope for the Baucus meeting on Wednesday that single-payer activists have wrested from him, this appointment, getting arrested in his hearings, demanding a voice for single-payer?
Well, you used the right word. The pressure on Baucus led to that meeting. It will at least begin to put single-payer on the table. Maybe it will activate the 78 members of the House who have already signed on the single-payer, H.R. 676, John Conyers' bill. It's a real step forward, although I don't expect Baucus is going to change his mind. Simply by having the meeting begins to elaborate a growing presence of single-payer on Capitol Hill.
And Brian Dees, the Times had a profile of him, the 31-year-old who is responsible for dismantling GM, never stepped foot in an automotive assembly plant until he took on this nearly unseen role in remaking the U.S. Automotive history.
That's the example of the recklessness of Timothy Geithner and Barack Obama and Larry Summers in appointing a task force that has no experience in manufacturing. It basically looks at this issue as a financial issue. That is, GM is going to be restructured to make money no matter where it makes it, in communist China or by staying here in the U.S. And the most important thing here, Amy, is that the head of the task force, Steve Ratner, as of 9 days ago, didn't know the answer to the question, are the GM assets and huge profits in China going to be put into the bankruptcy process to satisfy claimants, creditors, litigators who are going to be wiped out in product liability litigation or not? And he said, that's an interesting question. I'll have to look into it. Now, that is not a man who doesn't know that answer. He knows the answer to that question, but he wasn't saying, and nobody in Congress was making him say it. So we're dealing here with a corporate state, the kind of corporate state that Franklin Delano Roosevelt called fascism in a statement to Congress in 1938. That is, when government is controlled by private economic power, that's fascism.
Ralph Nader, finally, your allegation that Terry McAuliffe, who's running for governor of Virginia, primary next week, tried to bribe you to step out of the 2004 presidential race.
Clearly, in a telephone conversation in June 2004, he said, if you stay out of my 19 states meaning states that are close between Kerry and Bush, and just campaign in the 31 other states, that he, Terry McAuliffe, will support me and provide resources. He said that more than once. Stay out of my 19 states. That was clearly an attempted bribe, and that is all detailed in Teresa Amato's new book. It's coming out in 3 or 4 days, called Grand Illusion, The Myth of Voter Choice in a Two-Party Tyranny by New Press. And the reason why it's important is that Terry McAuliffe is now going to retrace Clinton's path to the White House. He wants to be elected governor of Virginia, which he's running for now, and the primary's coming up in a week, and then he has a springboard to the White House. And somebody who is engaged in the kind of political sleaze and the kind of attempted bribery, not to mention his other dealings with fat cats and backdoor maneuverings, I don't think can embody the trust that's necessary to become governor of Virginia.
Why wait till now to say this, Ralph Nader, 5 years later?
Actually, I said it on your program in 2004. Nobody listened. And Teresa Amato has put this in a book with great documentation that we do not have the semblance of a competitive electoral system in this country. We either give the voters one choice, namely the incumbent in gerrymandered congressional districts, or two choices, which are increasingly becoming similar on so many issues, like the military budget and foreign policy, and dialing for the same corporate powers. So it's part of a major reform book, this book, Grand Illusion, by Teresa Amato, and this episode is outlined in the book as being illustrative of the pressures against third-party and independent candidates who want to give voters more choice, new and fresh agendas, and redirections for our country.
We're going to leave it there, Ralph Nader. I want to thank you for being with us, longtime consumer advocate and presidential candidate for a president of this country, and Harley Shaiken, professor at University of California, Berkeley, specializing in labor and the global economy, was being talked about as possible labor secretary under President Obama. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, Israeli journalist Amira Haas. Stay with us.